And thank you, Jan, for joining us today. It's a great pleasure to see you again. I do recall your visit to Indiana University a number of years ago, and we were together actually in July of 2001 in Poland when we were both at Jedwabne for the 60th anniversary of the massacre in that town that took place and that you chronicled and interpreted so brilliantly in your book. Here's a copy of that book. I picked it up at a bookstore in Warsaw in July of 2001. And something happened when I purchased that book that's never happened before or since. Another customer in the bookstore saw what I was buying and screamed at me for buying this book. I knew, Jan, that your book had impact, but my gosh, I never expected impact of that kind. All of us who work as academic scholars and do the work that we do hope that what we write and publish will indeed have some good impact. But very, very few books come to mind that have been as transformative as your book, Neighbors, was and to this day is. It opened up then to for not much discussed chapter in Polish history during the war years and provoked a discussion all over the place that in some ways continues to this day. I teach the book every year in a course I offer on the Holocaust. It's essential reading for my students and others as well. So really, it's a great privilege to have you with us. For those of you who have not yet got the book, here it is in its English translation, published in the latest version by Princeton Press with a new preface by the author. Jan Gross followed that book up with two additional books that I'm aware of in English. This book, Fear, deals with anti-Semitism in Poland in the post-war period, and a shorter but also riveting book, Golden Harvest, deals with some related matters as well. Jan, we look forward to everything you have to tell us as you reflect on your work some 20, 22 years afterwards. Following your talk, we'll have discussion with people who've tuned in. We now hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alvin, for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak to your seminar, which has a fantastic track record. You've been braving COVID, I think, and then it just became a tradition, I suppose. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to that you have offered. And this is a very amusing story. I didn't know that you were assaulted right away in the bookstore and you tried to get it. I'll keep it in mind. I'll say it in the future. So without any further ado, let me launch into my lecture. As the saying goes, books have their own destinies, habent sua fatali belli. And Neighbors, I must confess, had one, which I could not have anticipated. Eventually, the book got translated into 13 languages. It was read widely and debated extensively, nowhere more so than in Poland. Alongside criticism, accompanied at times with acerbic personal attacks against the author, Neighbors also received its share of acclaim. In the end, it did not win any major prize, but was shortlisted for a couple of important distinctions in the publishing world: the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award in the United States, and it was nominated for the main literary prize in Poland, the Nike Award. A few years after the book's publication in 2005, when Princeton University Press celebrated its own centenary, it listed Neighbors among the 100 books the press treasured most. A small poster issued on this occasion included my photograph from the back cover of the hardback edition, a photo taken by my daughter, which I like very much, together with many clever and sympathetic faces of Princeton's authors, including the likeness of Albert Einstein. It won't surprise you when I confess that this was the recognition that I treasured the most. After all, how many of us can say that they have been in a photo together with Einstein? But enough of self-praise. Let me now get into the gist of today's lecture and try to place Neighbors in the context of historical writings about the Holocaust and my own work as a historian. I have been publishing books about the experience of the Second World War in Poland under both the German and the Soviet occupation for 25 years before I wrote Neighbors. Of course, I could not have written it until I came across the requisite documentation. But the reasons for the delay were also deeper, rooted in the manner historians were writing at the time about the war and the Shoah. It may hardly seem conceivable nowadays when books about various aspects of the Holocaust are published in abundance, that the mass murder of European Jews was in post-war, post-World War II decades, a subject shunned by scholars. The reasons for it, in my judgment, were multiple, having to do not only with the difficulty of contemplating the enormity of crimes committed, but also, I suspect, with the reluctance to confront different shades of complicity in Nazi-engineered evil by peoples and institutions in German-occupied Europe. With elegant restraint, in his magisterial study, Saul Friedlander put it thus, and I quote, "Not one social group, not one religious community, not one scholarly institution or professional association in Germany and throughout Europe declared its solidarity with the Jews. Some of the Christian churches declared that converted Jews were part of the flock up to a point. To the contrary, many social constituencies, many power groups were directly involved in the expropriation of the Jews and eager, be it out of greed, for their wholesale disappearance. Thus, and the following sentences underlined, just in bold print in Friedlander's book, Nazi and related anti-Jewish policies could unfold to their most extreme levels without the interference of any major countervailing interests, unquote. For much of the war, another historian has written, and now I am quoting from a book by a distinguished student of wartime Europe, Mark Mazower, and I quote him, "For much of the war, Europeans fell into lie and contributed what the Germans demanded anyway. After 1945, this was conveniently forgotten," unquote. This, I presume, must have had initially a chilling effect on academic engagement with the Shoah. In any case, it took a long time before extermination of the Jews emerged as a widely pursued subject of scholarly research. When Raoul Hilberg decided to write his doctoral dissertation at Columbia University in New York in the early 1950s, it would become the founding classic in Holocaust studies entitled The Destruction of the European Jews. His academic advisor, Franz Neumann, like Hilberg, an exiled Austrian Jew and an early student of Nazi totalitarianism, warned him that with such a topic for a PhD thesis, he stood little chance of getting a university appointment. Against considerable skepticism of fellow academics, Hannah Arendt, for instance, in a rare lapse of judgment, advised Princeton University Press to turn it down. Hilberg's book finally came out in 1961 at a small publisher, Quadrangle Books, thanks to a subsidy from a private benefactor. Hilberg will keep returning to this book for the rest of his life, publishing several updated editions as the years went by and our knowledge of the Holocaust expanded. This is and will remain his major opus. Let me also indicate at the outset that it was not the unavailability of data that made the scholarly community reluctant to engage with the subject of the Shoah in the aftermath of the Second World War. Remarkably, Jewish inhabitants of East European ghettos had launched several initiatives to document how they were being murdered, even while the killings were still going on. The best known of such endeavors was the so-called Onek Shabbat compilation of evidence on the mass murder of the Jews carried out in the Warsaw Ghetto. In a systematic effort, documents were assembled, witnesses were interviewed, and their testimonies transcribed. Social surveys on specific topics were conducted by a team of dedicated individuals under the leadership of a historian and social activist, Emanuel Ringelblum. Ringelblum himself did not survive the war. He had been captured and killed in March of 1944. But miraculously, most of the carefully hidden collection of documents was recovered from the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto after the war, and is now preserved in the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw under the name of the Ringelblum Archive. Furthermore, the Onek Shabbat Archive, or the Ringelblum Archive, as it is currently known in honor of its principal organizer, may have been the most complex and comprehensive compilation of documents put together by Jews as the Holocaust was unfolding, but by no means the only one. We know of several other collective enterprises of this sort, carried out in the Kovno Ghetto, for example, or in the Ghetto of Łódź, as if there were a pervasive awareness among the Jews, for such efforts were uncoordinated, that they need to preserve a documentation of contemporaneous events because they are unique, extraordinarily significant in the overall history of the Jews, and because the German perpetrators will try to destroy the evidence of their murderous efforts to wipe out the Jewish civilization and Jewish lives in Eastern Europe. There is an apocryphal story from the ghetto in Riga, the capital of Latvia, about the great Jewish historian Simon Dubnov. Allegedly, as he was being pushed with other Jews onto a deportation train, which would take him to an extermination camp, he kept shouting, admonishing all who could hear him, "Write it all down." Apocryphal stories, whether authentic or not, are meant to capture and illustrate the spirit of the times. Numerous Jews all over occupied Europe had been writing it all down, as it were. Undoubtedly, most of you are familiar, as it is an assigned reading in schools all over the world, with the Diary of Anne Frank. Many such personal documents, diaries and journals with far more dramatic content were left by Jews in occupied Poland. And then, in the immediate aftermath of the war, beginning in the earliest moments after the remnants of European Jewry emerged from hideouts and concentration camps, again, a documentation effort was launched, as Holocaust survivors were prompted by a nucleus of Jewish historians, social workers, and activists to record and collect their testimonies. Whether in Poland or in the displaced persons refugee camps, primarily in the American zone of occupation in Germany, where tens of thousands of Jewish survivors fled from the post-war upsurge of anti-Semitism in their own countries, which is incidentally a very important subject in its own right. How was it possible to be an anti-Semite in Europe immediately after the war, in the aftermath of the unprecedented mass murder of European Jews? In those so-called DPs, displaced persons camps, Jewish organizations, while dispensing aid, were also compiling documentation of the genocide that had just wiped out the lives of 6 million European Jews. In Poland alone, where the destruction of Jewish organized life was particularly thorough, the Central Jewish Historical Commission, active since the end of 1944 under the auspices of the umbrella welfare organization called the Central Committee of Jews in Poland, assembled over 7,000 testimonies. Today, they are housed in the archives of the already mentioned Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. This is where I read Shmuel Wasserstein's testimony, the starting point for reconstructing in my book entitled Neighbors, the Mass Murder of Jews in Jedwabne. But there were even more successful efforts to assemble and publish evidence about the Shoah immediately after the war. Scores of Jewish journalists who had emigrated to the Americas from Eastern Europe before the war rushed back as soon as Hitler had been defeated in order to find out and report what has happened. They had an eager and desperate audience, the readers of Yiddish language press on all the continents, who pined for any scrap of information about their communities of origin and the fate of relatives. A flood of brilliant reporting about the Shoah followed, with New York's daily forwards. At one time, this was a newspaper with a circulation of 250,000, being the leading venue for such writing. I do not know Yiddish, so I'm not speaking from my own experience, but reading a recent Polish language edition of a collection of Mordechai Tsanin's post-war articles from forwards, I discovered what a comprehensive body of knowledge about the Holocaust was available in the public domain at the time. As a result of all these efforts, continuing until the present day, just think of the visual history archive initiated by Steven Spielberg after he did his great movie, the docudrama Schindler's List. The Holocaust is undoubtedly the best documented genocide ever. And yet, despite all the available evidence about the mass murder of European Jews, decades passed before historians took on the subject. Why was it so? We may legitimately ask. The reasons, as with all important phenomena, were complex, and I suggested some already in this lecture. But I want to mention one more, which is particularly significant for my presentation today, namely a deep skepticism among scholars, indeed a rejection that persisted for a long time on methodological grounds of personal testimony as a reliable source for historical research. Raoul Hilberg, whom I have already acclaimed as a fundamental, indeed foundational contributor to Holocaust research, was an early advocate of this skeptical position. People's recollections are by definition subjective, he would argue, and hence open to criticism as unreliable. But they are not even needed to show the immensity of the Nazi criminal project, which can be demonstrated on the basis of objective, institutionally generated documentation. He proceeded in this fashion, wrote a fundamental book in the field, and a paradigm was established. Once academic research on the destruction of European Jewry was set in motion, the subject was framed in Hilbergian terms as a confrontation between Jews and Germans. This, of course, captured the gist of what has happened as a result of German Nazi genocidal policies launched against the Jews in occupied Europe. But in time, such a conceptualization began to show its limitations. To be sure, the German organized mechanism and apparatus of destruction was the kernel of the mass killing process, but it was also becoming clear to scholars that the local context mattered. Jews lived for centuries enmeshed in European society, and they had to be extricated therefrom in order to be put to or sent to death. Clearly, to conceptualize the intricacy of the process, a third term encompassing the role of other actors in addition to Jews and Germans was needed to move the discussion forward. Interestingly, it was once again Hilberg who came up with a felicitous suggestion. In 1992, he published a volume entitled Perpetrators, Victims, Bystanders, The Jewish Catastrophe, 1933-1945. And while the book's content did not generate overwhelming interest, its title, indeed one word from the title, made a phenomenal career. Bystanders became a staple of Holocaust historiography's vocabulary, filling the need for the third term. For the record, it needs to be noted that Hilberg's apparent understanding of who were the bystanders was really bizarre. Suffice it to mention some of the chapter titles included in the section on bystanders in his book: Helpers, Gainers, the Jewish Rescuers, the Allies, and also the churches or neutral countries. Quite a mishmash, and a few counterintuitive choices. One wouldn't think of what the helpers or gainers or rescuers were doing necessarily as emblematic of standing by. In any case, the term itself, bystanders, functions in historical parlance about the Holocaust until today. But with time, scholars began to question the concept. What could it mean to be a bystander when confronted with the radical violence to which the Jews during the Holocaust were subjected, especially in Eastern Europe? Standing by, a fitting characterization of what local people and institutions were mostly doing. Enough had been written about the contributions of the Vichy administration and France to the roundups and deportations of Jews, or the role of Hungarian gendarmerie in the summer 1944 mass deportations of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz, or about the killings of Jews carried out by auxiliary police formations staffed by locals in the East, to induce a critical evaluation of the concept. Today, in tune with the earlier quoted passage from Friedlander, a new monograph compiling supporting evidence, scholars would be inclined to recognize terms such as implicated subjects, facilitators, and/or beneficiaries as a more precise characterization of the contribution to the destruction of European Jewry by the surrounding population. More precise, that is, than what's conveyed by the term bystander. Now, and this is a methodological observation which I would like to make. The key in sharpening the awareness about the problematic role of local circumstances and the need to account for behavior of the local population in order to understand the mechanics of the Holocaust was a change in the valuation of personal testimonies as a source for historical knowledge. A change from deep skepticism to appreciation of the contribution which they make to our understanding of what had happened. For me, the path to relying on personal testimonies when writing the history of occupation in Eastern Europe during the Second World War opened fairly early. To start, I was trained as a historical sociologist, and the use of questionnaires, including open-ended survey data, as well as personal accounts, is the staple of the profession. But also, I was moved by an accidental discovery in the archives of the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace at Stanford University. I found there a trove of handwritten statements describing people's experiences under the Soviet occupation of the eastern half of Poland between 1939 and 1941. In the 1980s, together with my wife, I published 2 volumes of those documents. The English language volume was called War Through Children's Eyes, as we focused on children's school compositions that were preserved in the archival collection. And then I wrote a book-length monograph about the way Soviet power was introduced in the conquered territories, Revolution from Abroad, the Soviet conquest of Poland's Western Ukraine and Western Belarus, 1939-1941. Didn't know it's going to be relevant once again nowadays. I mention this because it turned out to be extremely important in the context of Neighbors, which I will publish 12 years later, that I knew all the documentation about the circumstances of Soviet rule in the area. Between September of 1939 and June of 1941, Jedwabne was under the Soviet occupation. Thus, the July 10th murder took place immediately after the German army conquered this territory from the Soviets. And the early criticism of Neighbors by unfriendly readers who wanted to dismiss the book without really discussing its content, that is, without confronting what has happened in Jedwabne. The criticism was that I did not understand that the context of the murder on July 10th, 1941 was the prior Soviet rule in the area and the alleged collaboration of local Jews with the Soviet occupiers. Having studied the matter for a decade and after publishing 3 books about the Soviet rule in Eastern Poland, I couldn't be fooled. In any case, since the release of Claude Lanzmann's documentary film Shoah in 1985, no one could doubt the significance of personal testimonies for understanding of the Holocaust. An epistemological argument in favor of this position could be put simply thus. During periods of social upheaval and disorganization, when institutions collapse and people's interactions are mostly unmediated by bureaucratic routines, when life of the community overflows regular channels, so to speak, and is no longer captured by institutional reporting, the best way, probably the only way to record and understand what is taking place is through examination of personal testimonies. Wars and revolutions belong to this genre of phenomena. A casualty report after a riot may give an objective count of the number of corpses found in the streets, but it will say precious little about what actually happened. Instead, subjective, personal testimonies offer an empirical foundation for making sense of what went on in such circumstances. The Holocaust belongs to such a category of violent, unstructured, and fluid social phenomena, which can best be understood on the basis of evidence produced by a myriad of individual experiences put together. So in hindsight, it seems to me that Neighbors' contribution was both methodological, by providing a powerful valuation of personal testimonies for the study of the Holocaust, and substantive, by providing a composite description of an extremely violent episode of local people's complicity in the extermination of the Jews. This was a story of just one little town, but historians had already known for a long time about a wave of internecine violence that decimated Jewish communities in a swath of territory conquered by the German army on the Eastern Front in the summer of 1941. Readers understood the Jedwabne massacre as a pars pro toto. A composite image evoked in Neighbors by multiple voices of witnesses and participants gave concrete and memorable shape to the violence, which could be seen as a compilation of well-delineated actions by specific, often named individuals, rather than chaos. The immediately launched investigation of this mass murder by the Institute of National Memory, IPN, in Poland, promptly identified some 20 other townships in the immediate vicinity where local non-Jewish Poles killed their Jewish neighbors, on occasion even before the German troops had appeared there at all. Neighbors had originally been published in May 2000 in the Polish language edition by a small printing house, Pogranicze, Borderlands. I appreciated the sensitivity of the subject, and had not been sure whether a mainstream publisher would be ready to take the book. My worries originated from a warning of sorts, which I received a few years before I even knew about the murder in Jedwabne or understood what has happened. In 1997, I published a small volume entitled A Horrible Decade, comprising 3 essays on Polish-Jewish relations during the war. None of the essays spoke about mass murder of Polish Jews by their non-Jewish neighbors. I didn't know at the time that such things as had happened in Jedwabne were possible. I merely noted that anti-Semitism was widespread during the war in all strata of Polish society. There is plenty of documentary evidence from the period to prove this, and I quoted the relevant sources. This was the reason why Jews were left without significant help from the rest of the Polish society when Germans proceeded to implement the Holocaust, I argued. It was not the fear of German retaliation for helping the Jews. Poles were notorious for flaunting German prohibitions during the occupation and established the most robust clandestine anti-Nazi underground state in all of occupied Europe. So it was not the fear of German retaliation, but rather the lack of a social norm that Jews ought to be helped that determined the Poles' behavior, I conclude. The director of the publishing house which put out The Horrible Decade, shortly after the book appeared, told me that for the first time in his professional career, he was confronted with a protest of workers from the printing shop who refused to work on the book because they objected to its content. He prevailed in the end, but this made me worry that I would not be able to publish Neighbors in Polish, and I firmly believe that the book should come out first in Poland so that people, academics, whoever, I did not know what the audience for the book will be, so that people have a chance to discuss it before the book comes out in English. I thought that the story about this mass murder should not come to Poland, as it were, from the outside. And it turned out that my intuition was correct. Henryk Woźniakowski, the editor of a great publishing house from Krakow called Znak, a sort of random house of Poland, where several years later, in 2008 and 2011, I published 2 more books on the subject of Polish-Jewish relations, recalls in his memoirs a conversation we had when I was working on the Jedwabne murder. He took our conversation, he says, as a sounding out by me whether Znak would be interested in the manuscript. At the time, he writes, he dropped the subject. I decided, this is Woźniakowski speaking, that we were not ready for it, unquote. Frankly, I don't remember such a conversation between us. I don't think I would have presumed that Znak might be interested in the publication of the book. In any case, when I had completed the writing of Neighbors and all these doubts and worries were going through my head, I also wanted to place the manuscript in trusted hands. I sent it to a friend who had, as I said already, a very small boutique publishing house. Krzysztof Czyżewski, the founder of the Borderlands Foundation, immediately recognized the book's significance and published it forthwith. Neighbors did not initially have a wide distribution. To be honest, it never had a wide distribution in a book format in Poland. In part, I suppose, because Krzysztof, while interested in publishing good books, does not necessarily pay attention whether they get sold. We didn't even sign a contract. I never earned a penny from the sales of the Polish language edition, and I do not know how many copies were sold. But when discussion about Neighbors took off, I asked Czyżewski to place an electronic version of the book on the Borderlands website so that interested people could download it for free. And he did. These were only the beginnings of the internet, but I soon found out that students availed themselves of this opportunity. I had a number of authors meetings in Poland at various university campuses, and the young people would come up to me with printouts of the book asking for an autograph. It took a good 6 months before the main daily newspaper, Gazeta Wyborcza, published an article about neighbors. After that, it seemed as if floodgates had opened, and a long, wide-ranging public discussion began, perhaps the most complex confrontation with collective memory and the need to revise it that the Poles had ever faced. Radio and television programs, newspaper articles and interviews, essays in professional journals produced between roughly November 2000, when public discussion took off, and July 2001, when the 60th anniversary ceremonies to commemorate the mass murder were organized by the state in Jedwabne. The president of Poland spoke there, among others. These articles and media productions on Jedwabne numbered in the thousands. Because the book's distribution was so inadequate, I worried that in this wide-ranging public discussion, people will mostly learn about the book's content from the voices of polemicists, which are necessarily partial and not capable or even interested to lay out the story in all its complexity. I decided that I need to make it relatively easy for the general audience, which was bombarded by the word Jedwabne from all the media, to find out on their own what I had actually written in Neighbors about the events of July 10th, 1941. And so I compressed the book to about half of its original size. The book is very small to begin with. And I got the second largest as to circulation daily in Poland, called Rzeczpospolita, the Republic, to publish an insert in its weekend edition with thus abbreviated text of Neighbors. In this way, I felt for very little money, a lot of people could get a firm grasp of the book's content. It was very important for the public discussion of the Jedwabne mass murder that the Polish state decided immediately to launch an official investigation of the matter. A newly created entity called the Institute of National Memory, IPN, which got custody of all the legal documentation concerning German crimes against the Polish nation, as well as the files of communist-era secret police, took charge of it. The investigation of the Jedwabne murder, both in order to establish the historical record and to prosecute people guilty of the crime if legally viable charges could be brought against them, was the first case that the IPN handled. On July 9th, 2002, the Institute of National Memory issued what amounted to a final communiqué concerning its 20-month-long investigation of the Jedwabne murder. This, in addition to 2 large-size volumes, 1,500 pages in all. I just want to show you what kind of a huge job it was that they did in the IPN. 2 volumes like this, if you can imagine. It's really very heavy and full of content. The findings, reported the New York Times on the following day, and I'm quoting from this article, the findings which have been eagerly awaited in Poland were a vindication for Mr. Gross, unquote. Key elements of the book's narrative have been therein confirmed. The murder of Jedwabne Jews was planned in advance by local inhabitants, and many flocked into Jedwabne in the early morning hours of July 10th from outlying villages to take part in it. Direct involvement of the few Germans present on the scene was limited to assisting in the early phases of the crime. Property of murdered Jews was plundered after the killing, and so forth. I'm going to abbreviate now because I see that I'm running out of time. The IPN worked under heavy pressure to prove the story of the Jedwabne murder wrong, or to fuzz the issue. But the impeccable integrity and commitment to public service of 2 officials, the prosecutor directly in charge of the investigation, Radosław Ignatiew, and the then head of the Institute of National Memory, Professor Leon Kieres, prevailed in the end. For his determination and fairness throughout the whole process, Kieres and his family received hate mail and anonymous calls. "The worst letters are kept away from me," was the title of a long interview Kieres gave for Gazeta Wyborcza's magazine on July 5th, 2001. And he was verbally abused in the parliament by right-wing deputies, one of them calling on Kieres to resign so that a real Pole could be appointed to his job. One element, however, of the otherwise scrupulous and professional handling of the investigation by the Institute of National Memory was incompetent. The exhumation of the mass grave in Jedwabne, which would have taken many months to be carried out properly, was completed in 5 days in June 2000. Forensic experts removed only the topsoil covering the mass grave and then tried to probe for its depths and boundaries. The procedure was cut short in deference to the demands of religious Jews in Poland and Israel, who were against disturbing the remains of the dead. But at least it allowed the IPN to identify remains of babies, small children, women, and elderly among the victims, and thus put an end to claims of right-wing apologists who implied the Jewish collaborators of Soviet secret police had been murdered in a revenge killing on July 10. Unfortunately, it was also the source of a hastily produced estimate of 300 to 400 victims allegedly being buried in the mass grave. Needless to say, the character as well as the moral and historical implication of the Jedwabne mass murder remain exactly the same, no matter whether 300 people or 1,600 people were killed. Yet, because the IPN investigation established that all but a few dozen Jedwabne Jews had been murdered on that day, in order for the smaller number to make sense, one would have to account for some 1,000 additional Jews from Jedwabne and vicinity who we know this from census figures and testimonies of witnesses of the day's events who were in town on July 10. In any event, IPN investigators evidently felt bound to accept the figure produced as a result of the incomplete forensic expertise they commissioned. Ironically, this is a point taken up now entirely in bad faith by extreme right-wing xenophobes who argue that the IPN investigation is inconclusive. Indeed, no means conclusions, and that Poles would be exonerated had the exhumation not been interrupted in deference to Jewish religious law. For the record, I want also to make clear that I protested in writing at the time. In Gazeta Wyborcza, I wrote an article against cutting the exhumation short. And then later on, again, I'm just skipping over some details. Later on, I've been told by very respected Jewish rabbis who reflected on the case and actually have written on it, that given the circumstances under which this murder had taken place, it would have been very much proper to carry out a full-scale exhumation, and that those who protested against it just know the Jewish law. What can I say? I want to just be quick now and say a few words about the consequences of the publication. So one that I treasure most, and I think is most significant as far as Polish awareness of what has happened during the Second World War and the understanding of its own history, is the emergence of extraordinarily detailed and varied scholarship on the issue of Polish-Jewish relations during the war. Of particular significance in this respect was the establishment and the creation of the Center of Research on the Holocaust of Polish Jews, established at the Polish Academy of Science. And from 2003 it exists. It publishes a yearly volume that big. By today, I think there are 18 volumes already. If you line them up, it will become the height of a grown-up person, which is full of just extraordinarily interesting writing on the, generally speaking, the subject of Polish-Jewish relations, and demonstrating in detail, and taking the issue from various angles, so to speak, what degree of complicity there was, and all of about in the process of persecution and even direct killings of the Jews, in which their neighbors, the non-Jewish neighbors, were implicated. So on the one hand, there is this phenomenal historiography, not simply produced at the center, but also and in the yearbook, which they published, but also in the writings and monographs of many scholars, some of whom are not necessarily affiliated with the center. For the last 20 years, these books were coming out, and reflections of all kinds. A lot of work has been done by artists, for instance. Very interesting films have been produced, very important theater plays. One of them, a theater play by Tadeusz Słowodzianek, which was written literally, taking as a canvas the story of Jedwabne, has won this the so-called Polish Nobel Prize in Literature, the Nike Prize. So, you know, it's everywhere. Not surprisingly, it also created a backlash. And especially since 2015, when this regime came to power in Poland, very nationalistic, xenophobic regime, that's really rooted ideologically in the spiritual and political program of national democracy, where anti-Semitism was really at the kernel, was the core of that ideology. Now they are a little bit cagey nowadays. Of course, being an overt anti-Semite doesn't fly very well, especially given the public opinion in the West. But then they manage and do what they can in order to undermine and, in fact, prohibit, in a sense, further research on Polish-Jewish relations during the war. It's part of the so-called politics of history in which they engage. And one of the most direct and fundamental tenets that they promote is the launching a kind of a presentation of this period in which allegedly the Polish population is deeply dedicated to helping out the Jews. This is its main form of engagement, which is a Holocaust distortion. This is unfortunately a lie. It has not been that way. A lot of people in Poland who have engaged in helping out the Jews have paid for it dearly with their lives, the lives of their families. But sad to say, the circumstances in which such catastrophes have taken place were largely due to denunciations by their neighbors. And those who are recognized in Israel as righteous among nations have been, for many decades in Poland, treated as pariahs in their own communities, and they were afraid for the information that such was their activity and role that they took upon themselves during the war to come out and become public. So I'm sorry I didn't follow the text literally, but I think I ran out of time. I'm out of practice lecturing, so I don't know anymore how many minutes so many pages will take. And let me simply say that on one hand, this official situation and official policies of the current regime in Poland are abominable with respect to historical record and truth about Polish-Jewish relations during the war. But on the other hand, the literature in the Polish language that has been produced in the last 20 years, historical and broadly speaking, in the humanities, as well as artistic productions, are just an extraordinary variety and richness document the drama of engagement of the local population, unfortunately, in activities that made Jewish survival very, very difficult in the context of German policies of extermination of the Jews. Thank you very much.